It is a great pleasure to welcome to the program two old friends, namely Victor Davis Hanson and Bruce Thornton. They're old friends in a double sense. They're both old friends of this program, have been often on this program, and they are old friends of each other, having been colleagues together in the Department of Classics for many years at the University of California at Fresno. Victor, good evening.
Good evening.
And Bruce, good evening to you.
Hello, Milt.
I want to start with a quick observation. It seems to me that when it comes to students of classical antiquity and the civilizations of classical antiquity, which both of you are in a paramount sense of achievement, that very often they tend to be quite pessimistic about the prospects for contemporary civilization, for the civilizations that they inhabit. That was true of Nietzsche, who was a great student uh, of Greek civilization, was true of Oswald Spengler, was true of Arnold Toynbee, and I think clearly it is true at least of Bruce Thornton, with whom we discussed only a little while ago his most recent book, Decline and Fall, Europe's Slow Motion Suicide. You hold to your view, Bruce. Europe is engaged in an act of suicide.
Well, it certainly appears that way. All of the indicators that we talked about last time, it's hard to see how they can, progress back to the sort of strength that Europe once had, let's say, prior to World War One.
Now, here's what Victor said about your book and about your line of work generally. And I'll ask Victor to elaborate around this quotation. But you said a while ago at National Review, in a number of important books and articles, Bruce Thornton has written passionately about Western culture, contemporary society, and the current war against radical Islam. Now in Decline and Fall, that's the title of Bruce's most recent book, he combines those literary and historical skills to analyze why Europe has turned its back on a once illustrious Western tradition. The result is not merely a post-mortem on the failed European utopian experiment, but also a brilliant meditation itself on the human condition and our dangerous pursuit of heaven on earth. Do, by all means, Victor, elaborate further.
I think as a classicist, Bruce, getting back to your earlier point, sees that, at least in the ancient mind, and the great historians from Herodotus or Thucydides or Tacitus, didn't believe in a steady advance of progress. Remember, this was a pre-technological society, and they had seen periods in their illustrious past, the age of heroes of the Trojan War. They had seen the Peloponnesian War destroy the majesty of 5th century Athens. So, in their view, things ebbed and flowed. And given the tragic nature of humankind, that he was full of pathologies, they didn't have these grandiose expectations that we did, given the 20th century and the promise of technology. They didn't confuse technological progress with moral progress. In fact, I could go a step further, as Bruce has done in the book. They made the opposite conclusion, that with material progress you had moral regress, because of this idea that the Romans called luxus, that man, given his nature, the more that he was pampered, free, leisured, and wealthy, the harder was it to voluntarily give up those appetites, which was necessary to live a virtuous life. So what Bruce argued, as I read the book, about Europe was that they have heaven on earth. They have a 35-hour work week in France. They have guaranteed job security. They have no defense. They have put their trust in the United Nations, the International Court. They're secular, if not atheist, in the majority. And they have a 2-hour lunch if they want. They have everything they need, but they're dead souls. They don't believe in anything. They allow people to be butchered, 7,000 of them in Serbia, 3 hours away. A Danish cartoonist makes a simple little caricature. There's nobody in Europe to help him. Salman Rushdie's in hiding when he goes to Europe. They lecture about Darfur. They would never do anything. Saddam Hussein means nothing to them. So they've lost. They don't believe in their society. They don't know how to define it. They don't want to defend it.
And they yield to Islamic ferocity on their own doorstep, so to speak, do they?
They do. They feel that they're captives of, I guess, the Enlightenment. They believe that everybody must appeal to reason in the way that they do, and they don't understand that if they they have a post-identity. They don't have any identity as Westerner. They don't defend their Reformation or Enlightenment or Renaissance, and they feel that everybody's that way. But the problem is that these postmodern people are dealing with pre-modern people who believe that, Arabs are superior, that Islam is superior, that the tribal system is superior, that your first cousin is always smarter than the national government, pre-democratic. And these people do have an identity, and they're willing to fight and die for it. And the Europeans are baffled, and they think that these people can be bought off or can be persuaded, and I'm not convinced that's possible.
Staying with classical sources for just a moment, and directly to Bruce, would you call yourself a Polybian? I think of Polybius, of course, who's one of the great cyclic theorists in early historiography, and he has a general view that all civilizations fall, and they fall essentially because with success, with material achievement, you get a loss of the faith that sustained them when they were rising. You get a kind of inner decadence and hedonism, and inevitably the barbarian horde from outside will move in and take over.
Now, I think that's that, of course, and the great insight of the ancients, and I think what we moderns tend to slight, is the role of virtue and character in sustaining a civilization. And what we look at is we look at material prosperity, we look at material power and material wealth. And so we think that that's the measure of a civilization's greatness. Yeah. But all that is a reflection of something that's not material. And it's virtue, it's things like courage and honor, avoidance of shame. It's chauvinism in the sense of believing that your way of life is not just different, as we're preached at in the multicultural classroom, but it's better, it's superior. And
you see all of that for the West anchored in the Christian in the faith of Christianity, which
absolutely. Just as a matter of historical fact, the West is as frequently is said, is the consequence of three cities: Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And it cannot be Western just with the classical or just with the Christian heritage. It's all of these put together. But these all have to be sustained, and they have to be nourished, and they have to be handed on to the next generation, which used to be the function of the educational system, and that's not happening anymore. So people don't know what it means to be Western and why that's superior and why that's better. And if they don't know that, then they're not going to be as ready to defend it or to try to see what's wrong, how it's declining and what they can do to change it.
You say that has to be handed on to the next generation. And in decline and fall, you make the further point that not only aren't these values and that faith handed on to the next generation, there is not as much of a next generation. That is the demographic crisis that is very, very significant in accounting for what's gone wrong in Europe.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it all hangs together because if you have something precious, you want another generation to hand it on to because you want it to live beyond your own generation.
And you make children.
Exactly. And then you see to it that they learn it. But if you don't believe in any of those immaterial or let's say spiritual values, or you only believe in your own pleasure, the present, then it doesn't make sense to have children.
Well, now, what are the hard data, either or both of you, please, on this, with regard to the demographic reality in Europe concerning the death and birth rates for native Europeans?
Well, it should be, replacement is 2.1 children per woman, and Europe averages, I believe, somewhere around 1.5.
1.6, I think.
1.6.
What's even more disturbing is the traditional areas of fertility in the southern Mediterranean, the northern Mediterranean countries like Spain, Catholic Spain, Orthodox Greece, Catholic Italy have the lowest. Mm-hmm. So the traditional areas where Europe was fertile is just the opposite, and I think it's very important because it sends a message that, and using a classical reference, that remember the Greeks said that we basically change diapers so that somebody later on will change ours. So there's a compact between generations, and also there's a notion of transcendence, that not only do you have a soul, but you try to invest materially, and you plant an orchard, you build an extra wing on your home so that somebody can inherit it. some of you lives on and you sacrifice. But when you don't have children, you make a conscious decision of two things. One, the state will take care of you when you're older, and you demand that entitlement from the state and indirectly from other generations that are not related to you.
That's the welfare state.
Yeah, because your children are not there to take care of you.
The welfare state is fully established in Europe, in Western Europe.
They
sure.
are, and you haven't taken care of children, they're not going to take care of you. And then the second, and I think even more disturbing idea, is that you live day to day. You don't feel that there's any transcendence, material or spiritual. There's nothing that, if you don't believe in a God and you don't believe in having children, then why in the world would you sacrifice for anything in Afghanistan? It makes no sense to put a Dutchman or a young Greek down in Darfur. You wouldn't ever do what we're doing in Iraq. We have Americans that are willing to risk their lives for the concept of democracy or freedom or what's morally right, or more importantly, the security of the United States, because they feel they don't want children to grow up in a world of 9/11s, or they believe that in a moral being that looks over us and wants freedom and moral people to succeed.
Yes, but Victor, there is one group of Europeans across the many nations of Europe which is quite fertile, which is demographically very productive. And that, of course, is the ever-increasing Islamic population.
Because, according to this definition, they fit the pattern perfectly. And I'm not using a moral judgment, but they believe that they're going to pass on something for their children, the caliphate or a radical Islamic world, and they believe that there's not only a spiritual, but there is, as we know, a material reward in heaven for them. And so even though it's an aberration of what we would consider the Christian idea of brotherly love or the European idea of the Enlightenment, as I said before, they have an identity, and they're willing to die for it. We don't have an identity, but unfortunately, they can't channel that emotion and that zeal within the auspices of constitutional government or democracy. And we, who have democracy, don't have any spiritual or emotional drive. So we're mirror images of each other.
Bruce, in your book, Decline and Fall, which we've discussed on this program, and which is the centerpiece of our discussion again tonight, you certainly criticize European governments or European or native European societies for not demanding effective assimilation from the recent migrants, that is the in-migrants, who come essentially from the Islamic world. Is it conceivable that some governments might begin to try to socialize their Islamic neighbors, so to speak, so that they can become effective and loyal Englishmen or Scots or Germans or Italians or Spaniards or Frenchmen?
Well, they're starting to make some efforts, but then often it's so wrong-headed, because it's not in terms of what is great about the West and its permanent values. It's more a postmodern, multicultural, the sort of flabby tolerance that, well, the West is about accepting everybody as they are and not passing judgment. And the great example is I believe in the Netherlands, a DVD that they developed for immigrants, introducing them to Western life, and filled with images such as two women kissing or topless and these sorts of things, which is going to have the exact opposite effect. It's going to confirm Muslims in the decadence and worthlessness of Western civilization.
About a year ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury announced that inevitably Sharia law would have to become effective law in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. Whether to replace British law or whether to have equal honor in parallel to British law. Well,
I think he was thrown in the towel. He was saying there's nothing we can do about this.
Yeah.
And he may be right, because if Europeans and their intellectuals, and we have this problem in the United States too. Let's not just pile on the Europeans, because we have the same problem with our intellectual elites. We've been telling the world for decades now how corrupt the West is, how dysfunctional it is. That's the font of all imperialism, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're surprised when the rest of the world despises us. So who are we going to turn to within our own culture to make that case to immigrants or to the rest of the world of the value of the Western way, when many of our own intellectual elites don't believe in it themselves.
Well, you play directly into my hands. I have in mind to ask you, as I will in a few minutes, to what degree does this analysis apply as well to the United States? You remember that Mark Stein, in his book of about a year and a half ago, America Alone, argues, as you do, Bruce, that, as to use the language of Oswald Spengler, der Untergang des Abendlandes, the decline of the West, is moving well apace in Europe, but America still is a stronghold for the old Western values and must defend them. Whether America is in a position to play that role of conservator of Western civilization or not is a question I want to urge upon you shortly. But first, this immediate question to both of you. What is the prediction concerning Europe? If you think about where Europe will be 50 years from now, what do you see?
Well, there's several scenarios. One is the process in place is going to continue, and the Archbishop will be correct. There will be increasingly large autonomous Islamic enclaves, almost like sort of the reservations, Indian reservations in the United States. That, of course, makes it easier for there to be increased terrorist attacks, etc., in Europe, and even more appeasement. Another scenario is a backlash among native Europeans in terms of nationalist movements and extreme right movements and even neo-fascist movements, which would then present us with I think, a very chaotic, violent, and disruptive situation. But there's one scenario that doesn't seem to add up, and that's that Europe can find some way to deal with all of these problems that doesn't involve either capitulation or violence.
We have to remember one thing, that Europe is the embryo of the Western military tradition. It's got a larger population, the EU, larger expanded EU than does the United States. It probably has a larger GNP. So it's within the material ability of Europe, should it choose to rearm and be quite formidable as an ally hand in hand with the United States. We could do almost anything. And there has been some faint recognition of this. The EU's utopian agenda has been rejected by the Dutch, the French, especially the Irish, the Merkel, the Sarkozy, the governments in Denmark and Italy. They're starting to reject a lot of the socialism, utopianism, and cheap anti-Americanism. I wrote a column yesterday called "Why Does Europe Like Obama?" Very critical of Europeans, and I turned on my computer today and was flooded with almost 100 emails from angry Europeans saying, "Don't say that we like Obama, that's the mob does," but there's hundreds of thousands and millions of us who don't. And so I'm not quite as pessimistic as Bruce, because I think there'll be thinking people there who will see that, as Bruce wrote, they're on the road to suicide, and I can't believe they would just completely surrender 2,500 years of a culture in the face of a threat like radical Islam or demography.
I said when we began tonight that both of you, of course, are classicists and have studied and taught and written history concerning the classical civilizations, particularly both of you focused on Greece. Victor Davis Hanson's most recent book, one of many, is titled A War Like No Other. It is a re-examination of the Peloponnesian War, so fully documented but not accurate in every detail, by Thucydides. Bruce Thornton's most recent book, Decline and Fall, is subtitled Europe's Slow Motion Suicide, just recently published within the year by Encounter Books. And you've already mentioned Obama in Berlin, or Obama in Europe, which is a way of segueing to the current American political process and presidential race, and more broadly one can raise in that connection the question of how intact are we as a culture, or are we facing the same dynamic of decline, and if so, though perhaps on a slower schedule, and if so, what can we do to reverse that dynamic of decline? The two of you have done work together, of course. You edited a book, a fine book, a while ago titled Bonfire of the Humanities, which was a critique of how poorly we do the humanities in American higher education. And I fully endorse what you develop in that book and what your various anthologized authors do. But let me return to the basic question, and let me just get out of the way by putting this simple question to you and hearing, I would fain hear some discourse between you twain on it. With all that we've said so far, turn now to the American present presidential race and put it in context. How does it bear upon the matters we have been discussing?
Well, I think we've been given a great gift in the Obama candidacy because we haven't seen that postmodern view of the United States, that European socialist view, that utopian view so blatantly, explicitly voiced before. And just look at the Berlin speech, for example. He went over to Germany, and almost everything he said was factually incorrect, but he said that people in Berlin had not seen somebody who looked like him before. That was plain to his race, apparently. But of course they had, because for the last 7 years we've had two African American, not of mixed ancestry, but African American secretaries of state, including a national security advisor. And then he said that he was a citizen of the world, and went on to talk about the world making a stand with Berlin. And the world didn't make a stand with Berlin. The only person who stopped the communists from taking Berlin was Harry Truman and Curtis LeMay. Most of the European allies either could not or would not help. The British tried to do what they could. Most of the world was absolutely oblivious, just like they are today with Darfur. So he gave a speech to the world about being utopian and being citizens of the world, when he could have said, and he mentioned the flaws of America, but what he could have said is that there's a distinct Western tradition found nowhere else of constitutional government, free markets, and whether you like it or not, for all its fault, that's what the great hope of mankind can be. That's what Lincoln said, that's what FDR said, that's what Harry Truman said and did. And what the Europeans were rallying to was, I think, the following subtext, and that was, wow, we've won the argument of the 21st century. We got an American now who comes over and does not believe in American exceptionalism. He's not this cowboy like George Bush. He doesn't believe in the use of military action. He's one of us, and he's going to raise taxes, enlarge government, and turn over the muscularity of the United States to global governance. And that's why I think they were applauding. And I don't think that's going to go down well with the American people.
You just mentioned the email you got after your piece of yesterday from Europeans who are differentiating themselves from those who are so enthusiastic for Obama. What are they saying?
Well, they're saying Europe is a broad spectrum, and people, for example, in Holland, are very worried about radical Islam. In fact, if you look at some of Danish immigration laws, it would make our worries over the border look juvenile. And this myth that elite Americans, affluent, leisured, keep thinking they've lost their constitution when London has more surveillance cameras in every U.S. city put together, or there's no such thing as habeas corpus for the first 48 hours in some European countries. I mean, Europe does things that the American left would absolutely, if they didn't worship Europe, be abhorred if George Bush did it. So what I'm suggesting is many Europeans are saying, you know what, we are going to fight radical Islam. We're taking measures about immigration, about preventive detention, about the suspension of habeas corpus, and we're far beyond you on wiretaps or surveillance cameras. So don't lecture us about being, postmodern, because we understand the threat of radical Islam much more than you do. And not that all Europeans voice those sentiments, but a number do. And I think this is all going to work out to the good, because I think Americans are going to see a candidate who believes in sort of an Al Gore environmentalism. We've seen this utopian view. Nancy Pelosi said today she's trying to save the planet. Al Gore said he's trying to save civilization. Obama said he's trying to stop the waters from rising. We're starting to see this messianic view that a lot of these utopians have, and I think ultimately Americans who are very pragmatic, practical people with a very different history than most of the world are going to reject it.
Same question to Bruce Thornton. Put our American presidential race as it is bubbling right now into the context of all we've said so far.
Well, I think Victor's hit the nail on the head. I mean, just as John Kerry was, and Al Gore was, and to a certain extent even Bill Clinton, Obama is a European candidate. He has a utopian view of the possibility of what government can do, which is a hallmark of European society. He does not recognize the tragic limits on human action, the power of irrational human passions and affairs, which means that talk and diplomacy frequently are not going to be effective, and that brutal force will be. I think a lot of particularly European elites, like him, because what he's basically saying is he will sacrifice the interests of the United States to the interests of Europe, because that's what this is all about. Behind all the utopian rhetoric, there does exist some old-fashioned national interest on the part of European states, particularly the French, that sees their power dependent on the lessening of our power and influence. And so, of course they love him. I don't think I'm as optimistic as Victor is about what happens with the American people. I hope he's right. I hope that, we wake up on, after the first Tuesday in November, and we see that the majority of Americans have seen through the whole, fraud of this campaign, if that's not too strong a word. But I'm not so sure. When you look at the whole of our popular culture, our television, our movies, the media's incredibly shameful infatuation with Obama in his campaign, and when you see that this is reinforced every day in every school across America, in every university classroom, those are some very, very strong and powerful forces.
Well, how then does one account for that? How do you, in fact, account for the phenomenon of Barack Obama and the great marketing operation, which has run by David Axelrod and others, which has worked so effectively to bring millions into great enthusiastic confirmation of his presidential aspirations? And, of course, the great welcome that he's had even this very day in Washington from the other high figures of the Democratic Party. There is an Obama enthusiasm which has swept the nation. I don't share it. Clearly, the two of you don't share it. Mm-hmm. Tomorrow, I will get emails, Victor, which will criticize me for not having a pro-Obama presence on this program tonight. But how does one account for the Obama boom?
Well, I think there's two things. Excuse me, Victor. One, he's the anti-Bush, and the last 8 years we've seen some of the most irrational, strange political hatred. It eclipses even what some on the right had for Clinton, and Obama seems to be the exact opposite.
Has Bush brought some of that hatred upon himself by his own missteps?
No, I don't think so. I mean, he could have been a more effective communicator, perhaps, but this has nothing to do really with Bush per se, as it does as a larger worldview that we've been talking about, and that Bush seemed to embody, perhaps because of his personality and his personal style, in ways that were really grating. I think the second point, and what people don't want to talk about that's obvious, is the whole racial issue. The pathology of particularly white liberal attitudes towards blacks in the United States is all being laid bare by this campaign. And, people like Thomas Sowell and people like Shelby Steele have written perceptibly about this. And what we're seeing is the strange racism, I think is the correct word, of liberal America, in which they are so anxious to shed their racial guilt and to prove that they have not a scintilla of racial animus, that they've lost their senses over this mediocre candidate.
We should remember, too, that this is not Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice who, when they give a public speech, don't mention their race, but excel on their stellar records as diplomats or military officers. For all of Obama's talk about transcending race, he cannot give a speech without mentioning race. He said, "Oh, by the way, did I tell you that or they're going to use the fact I'm black. He goes to Europe, I don't look like people you've seen before. Race is always on his mind, and he offers white America, unlike Powell or Rice, who say to America, race is incidental to my achievement, to my character, to my persona. Obama says race is essential to my persona.
Actually, if you read his first book, it is totally, his memoir or autobiographical account, it is totally preoccupied with race.
Absolutely, and not to use that word again, but the subtext that white liberal America is, I can get rid of my guilt, I can get rid of the guilt of my supposed ancestors, and I can vote for this man, and very cheaply, I don't have to tutor in the ghetto, I don't have to go live in an integrated neighborhood, I don't have to send my kids to an inner city school. This is what I want. It makes me feel good about myself, it makes me feel good about my country, and the way he conducts himself, his elocution, he sounds transracial, except, of course, when he goes into the Reverend Wright sort of faux sermonizing in the black church. But it's pretty pathological, because this is somebody who said he was going to transcend race, and very quickly in the primary was getting 90% of the black vote, while he was complaining that his white opponent was appealing to racial solidarity by getting 60% of the white vote. And that's the rules that he's established, and there's a whole pathology there. He said that people who mention his middle name are trying to use anti-Islamic code language, and yet when he gives a lecture, he was asked the other day, why do people in the Middle East like you so much? Well, maybe it's because I'm exotic in my middle name. And with Barack Obama, there's always a two-way street. One saying, nobody can mention race, nobody can mention anything else about his name or anything, but he can at opportune times when it suits him. And if he wants to talk in negative and pejorative fashion about race, whether he characterizes the whole state of Pennsylvania as yahoos, or he says his grandmother was a racist, or that she's like a typical white person, then white people will suspend all criticism. So it's a one-way street, and anybody who, as you know from your email you'll get tomorrow, anyone who wants to take Barack Obama on his own merits as a 2-year senator who has an array of pretty repulsive people in his past, whether it's Retzko or it's Father Flieger or Ayers or Reverend Wright, or wants to look at what he said and what he said the second time, whether it's FISA, campaign finance, abortion, capital punishment, Iran, Iraq, all of these things we flip, you don't see a lot there. But if you just make those arguments, somebody somewhere on the left is going to say you're racist. So race is all right if you're Barack Obama, and you will use it to appeal to white guilt. But if you forget race and critique Obama, the gifted rhetorician who by no means has any qualifications for president, then you're going to be hit with a race card. So it's a win-win situation, he thinks, for himself.
Gentlemen, let me take a moment to invite telephone calls. And anyone who wants to join in this conversation to pose a question or offer a thought should call instantly. We have about 14 minutes left. The phone number is ever 591-7200. 591-7200. 312, the area code, if you need an area code. And if you want to reach us via email, that's extension 720 at tribune.com. Victor, as you're talking about his friends, and you mentioned one, Bill Ayers, one small item of some interest, and I mention this to our listeners who will find it on our program blog, miltsfile.com, is a speech that Bill Ayers gave just 2 years ago down in Caracas, in which he lauds what he calls the Bolivarian revolution that Hugo Chavez has instituted in his own country. And Chavez is in the audience, and of course Ayers is lavish with his praise for this Bolivarian revolution, and manages to get in a few nasty words about capitalism.
Yeah, well, I think the point is, Mill, I don't think you or I or Bruce or anybody mind if Obama, to jumpstart his career, wants to go and ask money from this creepy person. Or they don't think they really mind if he wants to sit there for 20 years by somebody damns America. Or they don't mind if he wants, as a legislator, direct money to Father Flieger. Or they don't mind if his wife serially says she has no pride in America, or it's a mean, downright mean country, or they raise the bar. We don't have any problem with that. But what we do have a problem with is after saying that and doing that for a quarter century, then to suddenly say that people who are bothered by that are somehow racist or insensitive. And I just don't think it's going to fly for most Americans are going to say, this is a free country. Your wife, your friends, you can associate with a group of people who feel that America, its past, its nature, its culture, is more pathological than positive. Fine. But if you want to represent all of us, we find that offensive, and we find your explanations for that behavior inadequate, and we find the policies that you advocate in line, in some cases, with your past career, and we're not going to vote for it. That's fine. But to then say to people, either you're a racist because you feel that way, or you're illiberal, or you're retrograde, or you're afraid of change, you're afraid of hope, that's what Obama's trying to do, and what we're essentially saying, this is the most liberal senator in the Congress, according to the National Journal and other people like ACLU, ADA, and he said things that are pretty outstanding in their nonsense. He said the other day that he wanted to create a mirror image of the Pentagon, a civilian defense force, the same funding. That would mean that you were going to borrow $500 billion a year to create something like that.
Let me put a...
it's pretty absurd, and yet we don't bring the light of reason onto what this guy says.
Now, since there is no representative of the Democratic Party here at the moment, I fear, let me ask either or both of you to do an effort to exert an effort of empathy or identification and role play for me what, for example, Cass Sunstein, yet another distinguished member of the law faculty at the University of Chicago until he's just recently moved to Harvard, what he would say if he were sitting here in response to what you're saying.
Well, he would attack George Bush. He'd say that we have record debt. He'd be right about that. He would say that we're in a precarious energy situation. He's right about that. And there's culpability to go around for Bush and the Republicans. He would say that he's a charismatic, messianic leader, Obama. He'd be right about that. I think that's about all he could say. I'd be welcome to debate him, but there's no doubt in my mind that we have not seen somebody so rhetorically skilled from a set speech on a teleprompter in 50 years. But remember that Obama's trying to do something that we haven't also seen in 50 years. We have not had a Democratic nominee from a northern state win the presidency since John Kennedy. Kerry couldn't do it, Mondale couldn't do it, Dukakis couldn't do it, Humphrey couldn't do it, McGovern couldn't do it. The only time they even have a chance is it's Gore, who won the popular vote, not the presidency, or Clinton or Carter. And so the nation's going to have to vote for a northern doctrinaire leftist, and they have not done that in a half century. And Obama knows that, and his handlers know that, and Cass Sunstein knows that. And therefore, you're going to see what you're seeing, that is, on foreign policy, on the death penalty, on abortion, on campaign finance, all of the positions that won the hearts and minds of the left, he's now going to refute, go to the center, and he's telling the left in coded language, put up with it. This is what happens in politics. I got to get elected, and then I'll give you your agenda.
Will it work?
I think it'll come close, but I think come September or October, it's not common in American politics with somebody who's only been a U.S. senator for 2 years to have the poise and the experience to carry that audacious plan out, because already we've seen him say there's 57 states, there's 47 states, Arkansas is next to Kentucky, we liberated Auschwitz. As if he's, what's wrong with speaking at the Brandenburg Gate? You know, presidents do that. He's not a president. So the chances are he's going to keep and continually to say things that are ridiculous. Let's create another Pentagon and save the world. Not because he's not bright. He's in some ways brilliant. He's a great speaker and communicator, but it's very, again, hard for anybody, Republican, Democrat, Independent, with only 2 years in the Senate, to run a long year-and-a-half campaign and not reveal his inexperience and in some cases his absurdity to the American people.
Gentlemen, let's go quickly now to the phones. Time is short, and of course we've got a full board of calls here. Here is the first. Hello, you're on the air.
Hello, gentlemen. This is Greg in Portage Park. How are you doing tonight?
Go ahead, sir, please.
What I wanted to comment about earlier was you were mentioning that Europe had lost its focus and identity and its original spirit in favor of prosperity, financial prosperity. I think it's a slippery slope that everyone can fall into because, in fact, you have to finance your dream and you have to find ways of funding to support your belief system. What happens, I think, over time is that we find that making money is easier than holding to our principles, and they slide away. And I think that that's a tendency that we're experiencing here in America. I'm extremely disappointed in both parties for bringing forth the candidates they have. I think they could have done better with a lottery. What do you think?
Some direct response from our guest, Bruce Thornton.
Well, I mean, it's true, and this is a historical truism that affluence, material comfort erodes the kinds of values that are required to maintain a civilization, which seemingly those sorts of values are encouraged and sharpened and strengthened by adversity. So there's a general, I think, human predicament here, and I think your caller's right about that. As far as the candidates, a democracy tends to get the candidates the citizens deserve, and there may be better ones out there, but these are the ones that we've got, and they reflect, I think, where we are as a people right now. And where we are as a people is not very well educated, not very well informed, despite having more information than ever, not very sharp at critical thinking. Otherwise, everything that Victor was talking about with Obama's inconsistencies, etc., would have derailed him by this time.
We're going down to the wire, fellows, with only 5 minutes left. So I must be rather abrupt. Let me quickly read you an email. Okay, Milt, let's hear why McCain is the better candidate. Balance this a little, please, says the listener.
I could answer that.
Please.
I think that he encapsulates a lot of Bush's strengths. He didn't want to cut and run in Iraq. When he supported the war, he took responsibility to at least stick with the policy through thick and thin, and saw that defeat would be catastrophic, so he supported the surge when few did. His big criticism of Bush was the record deficits. He was against earmarks. He was for balanced budgets. Remember, the tax cuts have not led to a loss in revenue. The deficits are a direct result of out-of-control federal spending, which McCain opposed. I have a lot of disagreements with him on campaign financing. I think he's not as strong as he should be about closing the border, at least originally. But on spending and American security abroad and fighting the war on terror, and right now, and also I must mention that we all want wind, solar, we all want plug-in cars, but we're 15, 20 years from that, and we'll work to get it. We don't want to go bankrupt by subsidizing our enemies to the tune of $700 billion a year, and that means we've got to develop coal, clean coal, nuclear power, more natural gas, and especially more oil here, and all of those I think Obama's against.
Let's go quickly to another listener. Here is the next. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, yeah, I'm a clothing retailer in Chicago, and there's a lot of similarities between the Obama campaign and a fashion item. When a new item comes online, like bell bottoms, people rush to it, and as soon as it takes about a year, and then it begins to go down. It goes down with a thud, and that's what's happening with Obama. He's new, but when push comes to shove and people get into the booth, they're going to go for the Levi. They're going to go for the staid and true Levi. He's a bell-bottom. They'll have a year and a half, 2 years of fashion statement, and it'll be over. And
well, but you elect a president for 4 years, sir.
No, his campaign he won't make it. He won't make it to November. It'll be over. It's been a year and a half already, and you can see his numbers are dropping now. He's an empty suit, and people will realize that, and they'll go back to something tried and true, McCain. And I like Obama, but I know what's going to happen when someone doesn't have the experience, they don't have the long-term knowledge that you need to be president, and people realize that, and that's what's going to happen. You'll see the numbers dropping.
Well, it's an interesting prediction. I'm not sure that you can generalize from sartorial reality to political reality. But let's turn to Victor Davis Hanson and Bruce Thornton on that one.
Well, I hope he's right. I don't want to be wearing bell bottoms come November.
Right. I wrote a little essay once called "The Pet Rock," and I think it's the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
There were people who went out and got stones and paid $10 to put a stone on their counter, and I think that when I talk to young people, when I work at a university, and I'll say, "Why are you voting for Obama?" And they'll say, "Hope and change." And I'll say, "Can you be more specific? What's he for? What exactly is he for? What is he for about Iraq? What does he want to do in Iran? What does he want to do about energy? What's he feel about campaign finance reform? What's his position on immigration? What's his position on capital punishment, abortion?"
Victor, I can't resist. There's literally only about a minute and a half left. What's the Athenian equivalent, 5th century BC? Alcibiades? Or?
Yes, I think it's Alcibiades, absolutely. We had a very gifted speaker he wasn't an oligarch, he wasn't a Democrat, he wasn't for Sicily, he wasn't against Sicily, he was a common man, he was a wealthy man, he was a poor man, he was a general, he was a man in the rain. He was anything that anybody wanted from him at any given time. And as your caller said, that he was enormously popular until people found out that he had no core values. And I think that when I talk to young people, they can't articulate at all what his position is. They have no idea, except that, as Bruce said, he's not from Texas, he's not a Bible thumper, he doesn't have a twang, he doesn't say things like smoke them out, round them up, dead or alive, and that right now at this moment seems to be appealing to a lot of people.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. I am very grateful to both of you for joining us on rather short notice. Our guests have been Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution, Bruce Thornton of Fresno State University, both of them leading classic scholars and very significant and interesting commentators on contemporary society and its politics.